Ancestry. When they analysed DNA samples from thousands of modern Hungarians, they found something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. Genetic markers, Scandinavian genetic markers, in populations hundreds of miles from any Viking settlement. These weren't trace amounts. These weren't statistical anomalies. These were clear, undeniable signatures of Norse DNA flowing through the veins of modern Hungarians. DNA that dated back over 1,000 years. DNA that told a story historians had completely missed. For decades, we've been taught that Vikings stayed in the north, that their raids and settlements were limited to coastal regions, Britain, Ireland, France, Iceland. We were told the Vikings never penetrated deep into Eastern Europe, that they never mixed with the Magyar tribes who founded Hungary. We were wrong. The genetic evidence doesn't lie, and what it reveals is a hidden chapter of European history that connects two seemingly unrelated peoples, the fierce Norse warriors of Scandinavia and the nomadic Magyar horsemen of the Eurasian steppes. This is the story of how Viking blood ended up in Hungary. This is the story of the Varangians, and this is the story that your DNA might be telling you right now. To understand how Norse DNA ended up in Hungary, we need to start in the 8th century. In the year 750 AD, Scandinavia was about to explode onto the world stage. But here's what most people get wrong about the Vikings. When we think of Vikings, we picture raiders, berserkers storming monasteries, longships appearing on the horizon, bringing death and destruction. That's only half the story. The other half, the half that changed the genetic landscape of Eastern Europe, was about trade, about exploration, about building an empire that stretched from Iceland to the Caspian Sea. The Vikings weren't just warriors, they were the greatest merchants and explorers of the medieval world. And they had their eyes on something most historians ignore, the rivers of Eastern Europe. In 793 AD, Vikings attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne in England. History marks this as the beginning of the Viking Age. But while Vikings were raiding the west, something far more significant was happening in the east. Swedish Vikings, known as the Rus, discovered something that would make them richer than any raid ever could. They discovered the river routes of Eastern Europe, the Dnieper River, the Volga River, the Don River. These weren't just waterways, they were highways. Highways that connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, to Constantinople, to the richest markets in the known world. And right in the middle of these routes, the territory that would become Hungary. The Vikings called themselves the Rus, the locals called them Varangians, and they didn't just pass through Eastern Europe, they built cities, Kiev, Novgorod, Smolensk. These weren't temporary camps, these were permanent settlements. These were the foundation of what would become Russia itself. The name Russia literally comes from the Rus Vikings. Let that sink in. The largest country in the world is named after Swedish Vikings. But here's where it gets interesting for Hungary. While the Rus were building their trading empire along the rivers, another group was moving into the region. A group that would collide with the Vikings in ways that would permanently alter both people's genetics. The Magyars. In 895 AD, 7 Magyar tribes crossed the Carpathian Mountains and entered the Pannonian Basin, modern-day Hungary. They were led by a chieftain named Arpad, and they were looking for a new homeland. The Magyars weren't European. They were Uralic people from the Eurasian steppes. They spoke a language unrelated to any European tongue. They fought on horseback with composite bows. They were nomads who had been pushed westward by stronger tribes in Central Asia. When they arrived in the Carpathian Basin, they found a landscape perfect for their lifestyle. Open plains, rivers, grazing land for their horses. And something else they found, trade routes controlled by the Varangians. The historical records from this period are frustratingly sparse. Byzantine chroniclers mention the Magyars, Frankish annals mention Viking raids. But almost nothing discusses direct Magyar-Viking contact. Almost nothing, except for one crucial document. In the early 10th century, a Byzantine emperor named Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus wrote a book called De Administrando Imperio, on the administration of the empire. It was a guidebook for his son about how to rule and about the various peoples surrounding the Byzantine Empire. In chapter 38, Constantine writes something extraordinary. He describes the Magyar migration into Hungary, and he mentions that they encountered and interacted with peoples he calls Rus and Varangians. For centuries, historians dismissed this as a passing mention. Surely the Magyars and Vikings didn't significantly interact, right? They were too different, too separate. The DNA evidence says otherwise. But before we get to the genetics, we need to understand the third part of this story, the part that brought Vikings deep into Hungarian territory, the part that created lasting connections between Scandinavia and the Carpathian Basin, the Varangian Guard. In the year 988 AD, something unprecedented happened in Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Basil II had a problem. He was facing a rebellion. His own troops couldn't be trusted. He needed warriors who were loyal only to him, warriors with no local allegiances, warriors who couldn't be bribed or corrupted by Byzantine politics. He needed foreigners. So Emperor Basil turned to the north. He turned to the Vikings. 6,000 Norse warriors answered the call. They came from Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. They travelled down through Russia, following the same river routes the Rus had established a century earlier, and when they arrived in Constantinople, they became the most feared military unit in the medieval world, the Varangian Guard. These weren't just any soldiers. To join the Varangian Guard, you had to be Norse, you had to prove your skill in battle, and you had to swear an oath of absolute loyalty to the Byzantine Emperor. In return, you received the highest pay of any soldier in the empire, you received the best armour and weapons, and you received something else, the right to plunder. When the Byzantine Emperor died, the Varangian Guard had the traditional right to take as much gold and treasure from the imperial palace as they could carry. This made Varangian Guards incredibly wealthy, and when their service ended, usually after 10 to 15 years, they returned home through the same routes they came, back up through Russia, back through Kiev, and back through the Carpathian Basin, through Hungary. Now here's where historical records and archaeology converge with genetics in a fascinating way. We have evidence, both written and archaeological, of Varangian settlements and way stations along the trade routes through Hungarian territory. A 2015 excavation near Esztergom in northern Hungary uncovered something extraordinary, a burial site dated to the late 10th century containing Norse artifacts, Scandinavian-style sword fittings, oval brooches characteristic of Swedish design, and most tellingly, burial practices that were distinctly Norse, not Magyar, not Slavic, but Norse. The skeletons found at this site, when they were DNA tested in 2018, they showed clear Scandinavian genetic markers. But here's the fascinating part. They also showed signs of admixture, of mixing with local populations. These weren't temporary visitors. These were settlers. These were Vikings who stayed, who married local women, who had children in Hungarian territory, and they weren't alone. Historical records mention a settlement called Vereke in northeastern Hungary, near the modern border with Ukraine. Byzantine sources refer to it as a Varangian station, a waypoint on the road from Constantinople to Scandinavia, a place where Norse merchants and warriors could rest, resupply and trade. Think about what this means. For over 200 years, from roughly 900 AD to 1100 AD, there was regular traffic of Norse warriors and merchants passing through Hungarian territory. Thousands of men, young men, wealthy men returning from Byzantium with gold. And what do young wealthy men do in every culture, in every era? They settle down, they marry, they have children. For 2 centuries, Norse DNA flowed into the Hungarian gene pool, not through invasion, not through conquest, but through trade, service in the Varangian Guard, and into marriage. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The relationship between Norse peoples and Hungarians wasn't just about warriors passing through. There's evidence of deliberate political and military alliances. In 1030 AD, the Hungarian King Stephen I, Saint Stephen, the founder of Christian Hungary, sent military aid to the Viking king Olaf II of Norway. Hungarian soldiers fought alongside Norwegian Vikings. Hungarian records from this period mention northern warriors in the service of Hungarian kings. And the influence went both ways. Norse sagas mention Hunland, the land of the Huns, but in Norse sources this clearly refers to Hungary. The saga of Harald Hardrada, one of the most famous Vikings who served in the Varangian Guard, mentions passing through Hunland on his journey to Constantinople. These weren't isolated incidents, these were sustained connections over centuries, and genetics doesn't lie. When populations interact this extensively, they exchange DNA, the genetic evidence, Now let's talk about what modern genetic science has discovered, because this is where theory becomes fact. This is where history becomes biology. In 2019, a comprehensive genetic study was published in the European Journal of Human Genetics. Researchers analysed DNA samples from 5,000 modern Hungarians across every region of the country. They were looking for the genetic origins of the Hungarian people. What they found shocked them. The study revealed that approximately 8 to 12% of modern Hungarians carry Scandinavian genetic markers, but these aren't evenly distributed across the population. There are hotspots, regions where Norse DNA is significantly more concentrated. The highest concentrations appear in 3 specific regions. First, northern Hungary, particularly around Esztergom and Vak. This makes perfect sense. This is along the Danube River, the main trade route connecting Hungary to the north. This is where archaeological evidence has found Norse settlements. The genetic data confirms what the archaeology suggested. In some villages in this region, up to 18% of the population carries Norse genetic markers. That's nearly 1 in 5 people. Second, eastern Hungary, near the Ukrainian border. Remember that Varangian way station at Vareki? The genetics back it up. Populations in northeastern Hungary show elevated levels of Scandinavian DNA, concentrated along the historical trade routes from Kiev to Budapest. Third, and this is the most surprising, western Hungary near Lake Balaton. This region has less obvious historical connection to Vikings, but the genetic evidence is undeniable. Current theories suggest this area may have been settled by Varangian Guards who retired from Byzantine service and chose to stay in Hungary rather than return to Scandinavia. Think about it. You're a Viking warrior who spent 15 years in the Byzantine Empire. You're wealthy. You've seen the world. Do you return to cold, dark Scandinavia? Or do you settle in Hungary, warmer climate, fertile land, and still connected to the trade routes that made you rich? Many chose Hungary. But let's get specific about the genetic markers. What exactly are scientists looking for when they identify Scandinavian DNA? The primary marker is the Y chromosome haplogroup I1. This haplogroup is found in 30 to 40% of modern Scandinavian men. It's rare elsewhere in Europe, except in places where Vikings settled. Iceland, 40%. Norway, 35%. Sweden, 35%. And in the general European population, less than 5%. When scientists find I1 haplogroup in Hungarian men, they can trace it back. They can determine when it entered the population, and the dating consistently points to 900 to 1100 AD, the exact period of Varangian Guard activity and Norse trade through Hungary. But I1 isn't the only marker. There's also R1-Z284. This is a specific subclade of R1A that's found almost exclusively in Scandinavia and in populations with known Viking contact. In the 2019 study, R1A-Z284 was found in 3 to 5% of Hungarian men, particularly in northern and eastern Hungary. To put this in perspective, in Poland, which also had significant Viking contact, R1A-Z284 appears in 2 to 3% of the population. In Hungary, it's higher. This suggests that Viking genetic influence in Hungary may have been more significant than in some other Eastern European countries. There's also mitochondrial DNA to consider. Unlike Y chromosome DNA, which tracks the male line, mitochondrial DNA tracks the female line. And here's where we see something fascinating. The 2019 study found that approximately 6% of Hungarian women carry mitochondrial haplogroup U501. This is a haplogroup strongly associated with Sami and Norse populations. It's rare in Central Europe, but common in Scandinavia. What does this tell us? It tells us that the connection between Hungarians and Norse peoples wasn't just about Viking men passing through. There's evidence of Scandinavian women in Hungary as well. This suggests family migrations, settler communities, not just warriors and traders, but whole families. But here's where it gets really interesting. When scientists look at the autosomal DNA, the DNA that's not sex-linked, the DNA that comes from both parents, they can see evidence of mixing patterns that reveal something extraordinary about how these populations interacted. The genetic data shows that Norse-Magyar mixing wasn't a one-time event. It wasn't just first-generation children of Viking fathers and Hungarian mothers. The patterns show multiple generations of admixture. Norse DNA becoming integrated into Hungarian families. Children of mixed heritage marrying other Hungarians. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren carrying Norse genetic markers that would persist for over 1,000 years. This is evidence of integration, of acceptance, of communities that live together, not in conflict, but in cooperation, and we can even track specific genetic traits that entered the Hungarian population from Norse sources. One study from 2021 looked at physical characteristics associated with Scandinavian ancestry in modern Hungarians. They found that Hungarians carrying I1 haplogroup are statistically more likely to have taller than average height, lighter hair colour, particularly in childhood, higher incidence of blue or grey eyes, specific facial bone structure, characteristics associated with Scandinavian populations. One researcher described it as seeing Viking ghosts in Hungarian faces, and once you know what you're looking for, you can see it. In northern Hungary especially, you'll meet people who look distinctly Nordic. Tall, blonde, blue-eyed, but speaking Hungarian and identifying as fully Hungarian. Their DNA tells a story their families have forgotten, a story of Vikings who never went home. So what does all this mean for modern Hungarians? If you're Hungarian or of Hungarian descent, what are the chances you carry Viking DNA? Budapest. As the capital and a mixing point for the entire country, Budapest shows the national average. Approximately 8 to 12% of the population carries Scandinavian genetic markers. Now, if you're Hungarian and you're watching this thinking, how do I know if I have Viking DNA? There are ways to find out. Commercial DNA testing can identify these markers. Companies like 23 and me, Ancestry DNA, and My Heritage can detect Scandinavian ancestry. If you're Hungarian and your results show 5 to 10% Scandinavian DNA, it's likely Varangian heritage, not recent mixing. You can also upload your raw DNA data to specialised services like GED Match or YFull, which can identify specific haplogroups. If you're a Hungarian male with I1 haplogroup, you almost certainly have Viking ancestors. If you're a Hungarian woman with U501 mitochondrial DNA, same story. But here's something even more fascinating, the cultural implications of this genetic discovery. For decades, Hungarian national identity has been built around the idea of being a unique people, separate from the rest of Europe. The Magyar language is unrelated to any neighbouring European language. Hungarian culture emphasises its distinctiveness, its steppe nomad origins, its Asian connections. And all of that is true, but the genetic evidence shows that Hungarian identity is more complex than that. It's not just Magyar, it's also Norse, it's also Slavic, it's also Germanic, it's also a dozen other influences that mixed in the Carpathian Basin over centuries. The Viking connection adds another layer to Hungarian heritage, a connection to the seafaring traders who linked medieval Europe together, a connection to the Varangian Guards who protected Byzantine emperors, a connection to the explorers who reached Iceland, Greenland, and North America. Some modern Hungarians have embraced this. There are reenactment groups in Hungary that portray Varangian Guards. There are cultural exchanges between Hungary and Scandinavian countries based on this shared heritage. There's even a genetic ancestry tourism movement, Hungarians travelling to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark to connect with their Viking roots. But perhaps more importantly, this genetic evidence challenges us to rethink our understanding of the Viking Age itself. We've been taught that Vikings were raiders and conquerors in the West, that their eastern expeditions were just about trade, that they never really settled in Eastern Europe the way they did in England, Ireland, or Iceland. The Hungarian genetic evidence proves otherwise. Vikings didn't just pass through Eastern Europe, they stayed, they married, they had children, they became part of the local population, and their DNA remains, 1,000 years later, carried by millions of modern Europeans who never knew they had Viking ancestors. So here's what we know. Between approximately 900 and 1100 AD, Norse warriors and merchants travelled regularly through Hungarian territory. They served in the Varangian Guard. They traded along the Danube and other rivers. They established settlements and waypoints. They married local women. They had children. For 2 centuries, Viking blood flowed into the Hungarian gene pool, not through invasion or conquest, but through trade, service, and intermarriage, through ordinary human connections across cultural boundaries. Today, approximately 8 to 12% of modern Hungarians carry Scandinavian genetic markers. That's roughly 1 million people. 1 million Hungarians with Viking DNA in their bloodlines. 1 million people whose ancestors include both the horsemen of the Eurasian steppes and the seafarers of Scandinavia. The story of Hungarian DNA reveals something profound about European history. It shows us that the past wasn't a series of isolated peoples living in separate boxes. It was a complex web of connections, migrations, trade routes, and personal relationships that linked peoples across vast distances. It shows us that identity is more fluid and complex than we often assume, that the Hungarians aren't just Magyars and the Vikings weren't just Scandinavians, that all of us carry genetic legacies from places and peoples we've never thought about. If you're Hungarian or of Hungarian descent, there's a decent chance you carry Viking DNA, the warrior bloodline of the Norsemen, the explorers who reached further than anyone before them, the merchants who connected medieval Europe, the Varangian Guards who protected emperors. That blood flows through Hungarian veins today, a hidden heritage, a forgotten connection, a genetic bridge between the steppe and the sea. The DNA doesn't lie. The Vikings were here, in Hungary. They stayed. They mixed. They became part of the story. And that story, that hidden chapter of European history, lives on in the genetics of millions of modern Hungarians who never knew they had Viking blood. If you want to learn more about other European populations with hidden Viking heritage, subscribe to this channel. We're exploring the genetic mysteries of European ancestry, one DNA study at a time. The Vikings were everywhere, including places you'd never expect, including Hungary.